Okay, well, thank you guys for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I think most people do. I'm Louise Gardner. I'm the founder and managing director of Pledge Consulting. This month's webinar really came about because we did a symposium, a one-day online PMO focused event in August. One of the hottest topics that we had during the day was the way organizations use Agile, and some conversations got a little bit heated at one stage, and it was clear that people felt really strongly, about the way people should and do use Agile. So we thought to ourselves, well, let's have a one day, a 1 hour dedicated session on agility, and we thought, well, who do we know that's best placed to talk about this stuff? And automatically Michael came to mind. So Michael's a experienced Agile coach. He's worked with many of Australia's most well-known organisations. He's a renowned subject matter expert on Agile, and he's agreed this afternoon to talk to us about minimum viable Agile. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, look, welcome everyone on the call, on the webinar. I just want to make sure I do have a few slides, not too many. Don't be alarmed. So hopefully that's come through okay, and everyone can see that.
Looks good, Michael. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so just kicking off from Louise's intro. Today's session, really, I just wanted to make sure that we have some fruitful conversation, essentially, and a discussion about this. Certainly not my intention to pound everyone with slide after slide of a PowerPoint deck. So definitely I've got a few slides, not too many, and I want them to play more of a supporting role rather than leading role in our discussion. And so as we work through it, if you have questions, points, perspectives, and things like that, please share them as we go along. And Louise, I don't know, if I'm missing a chat or something, someone's mentioned something, please feel free to kind of butt in and just pause me at any moment if we want to sort of zoom in on any particular question or a point of discussion.
Will do. Thanks, Mike.
And so the whole concept, so I'll just kick off. So when we talk about minimum viable agility, and it is a bit of a cheeky title, acknowledging that whenever we start to talk about minimum viable, it's becoming such a used and abused term. And so, but what I wanted to do, my intent for putting that into the topic today was that because there's obviously, you don't have to be working too much in Agile to kind of start to recognize that there's so much noise around this whole topic of Agile. And over the last few years, we've seen such a proliferation of Agile frameworks and methodology and scaling this and Scrum at scale and safe. And it's like going to the local ice cream shop, and every time you rock up, there's like a new flavor. And it's a bit like that. And so the topic, the purpose of today's discussion is not to try and add to that, but if anything, is to try and pare it back to say, okay, well, you've got all these different philosophies, you've got all these different frameworks, and different organizations, large, small, etc., are applying different ways of working and for their context. But let's peel it back a little bit. Let's start to get into first principles. What are the basic building blocks that these are the things that, irrespective of whatever framework that we select, these are the things that at its core are what drives agility. These are the things that kind of helps organizations start to realize the benefits of Agile. And so that's my attempt, and I'm not saying what I say is right, but it's really just, I guess, reflecting based on my experience, what I feel like is kind of like your 80-20, I guess. And so the purpose of today is let's try to unpack some of those first principles, and let's really sort of try and separate some of the signal from the noise. So I'll just jump through now. You've probably all heard this before. Agile is some people say it's just a mindset. And so there's this whole sometimes emphasis around the culture parts, the mindset parts, and things like that. The collaboration, the self-organization, the transparency, all those different things, and then or the empowerment, etc. Or sometimes you and I've also seen on the other side where agile implementations or efforts become very process driven and become very process dominant, right? And so it just becomes, and I guess for the people, and I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if we're talking about people involved in the project delivery space, sometimes it's easy to jump straight into the process side of things. How does this link into the SDLC? How does this link into our project delivery framework and things like that? And so often what I find is that organizations often tend to sort of lean to one thing and or the other, or they've had an experience where they've brought in some consultants, and the consultants were like agile evangelists and talking about mindsets and things like that, and suddenly it's like, hey, there's no sort of structure and process around this stuff, and so that kind of gets poo-pooed. And so I've often find that it kind of swings one way or another, but it is important for us to keep in mind that they really do go hand in hand. And I know that might be saying something very simplistically, but that's the whole balance of process and mindset and structure, which I'll talk about later, is really important if we're talking about minimum viable agility, or the core components of that. I mean, I've just put up a quote up here on the slide, and it's a big statement, and no doubt. And again, I've just put this up in a bit of a cheeky way, because no doubt we've seen some of these big statements around Agile, right? Agile's emergence as a huge global movement extending beyond software is driven by the discovery that the only way for organizations to cope with today's turbulent customer-driven marketplace is to become agile. Agile enables organizations to master continuous change. It shows firms how to flourish in a world that is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Okay, so that's a big dream, right? That's a big statement, and it's a real, transformational, transcendent type statement that we get here. But the question is, that's a big promise, a big dream, but how? How do we execute that? How do we actually start to realize some of this promise within our context, within our organization? And we get, the agile evangelists will come out and they'll start to quote the Netflix, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Atlassians, the Amazons, the Ubers, and things like that, and all different players who've disrupted their industry. And part of this whole selling of the dream. But what does that mean for us? Well, what do I do? How can I apply this, and how can I start to make it work within my constraints, within my space? I don't know if you've seen this this particular little cartoon. I know it's pretty low res. But I thought it might be useful for today's discussion. Sometimes we think that, and I've certainly experienced, in my experience, where companies have tried to implement Agile, they go, oh, you know what, if we only implement this framework, then we're going to see just such a powerful transformation within our organization. We're going to see increases in customer value. We're going to see faster turnaround times. We're going to see speed to market in terms of delivery. We're going to start realizing our benefits a lot faster, all that kind of stuff. And so, or if I only apply SAFe, or if I only do this. And so sometimes what we find is that, as this illustration shows, one professor looking at the another, they've got a problem, and then in the middle then a miracle occurs. And then you get this result at the end. And then I think I was kind of looking at this, and I was thinking, we see similar things within, in terms of attempts at adopting Agile. We think, if I only did this, then somehow, if I get people certified, if I get people doing these courses, if I implement this framework into my organization, some kind of miracle is going to occur, and then my organization is going to be a lot more adaptive, customer-centric, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the quote down here being, I think you need to be more explicit in step 2. And that kind of goes back to hopefully some of the discussion that I want to sort of touch on today, is for us to try to attempt to become more explicit in step 2. What are those key building blocks that's going to help us start to realize some of those benefits of agility? Might just pause there. I don't know. Maybe I haven't got the appropriate screen open. If there's any.
Yeah, I just sent a note into chat. If anybody would like to ask a question as we go, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. Please feel free, jump in. You'll have to raise your hand in Zoom, and I can set your mic to live so you can ask Michael any questions you have. We will have time for questions at the end, but if there's something you'd like to dive deeper in as we go, please, as I say, just feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Louise. Yeah, I'll just pause every now and again just in case there are any questions. Just give myself a bit of a break as well. So I guess when we talk about minimum viable agility, I think it's important for us to kind of anchor on what do we mean by agility. And so what I've done here is just pulled out a few different quotes or a few different definitions that you might have seen, that I've seen, that you might have seen as well. And no doubt you've also had seen different interpretations of agility. And I'm happy for participants to share, their perspectives on this as well. But just a couple that I've picked up, for example, is an organization of engaged people that's relentlessly focused on customer value, that continually improves the way it operates, and that uses empiricism to swiftly embrace change in a sustainable manner. A lot of you would be familiar with the SAFe Scaled Agile framework, and their whole interpretation of business agility is the ability to compete and thrive in the digital age by quickly responding to market changes and emerging opportunities with innovative business solutions.
Can I ask a question, Mike,
Sure.
at this stage? We've all seen organizations adopt Agile in inverted commas. And as the IT team goes into a big SAFe implementation, or somebody comes along and says, we do Scrum now, and it tends to be implemented, at least initially, in pockets.
Yep.
How, in your experience, can that ever work, or does it always need a sponsor? What's the usual flow of successful adoption?
Yeah, look, Louise, yeah, definitely a good question. And I've seen both. I've seen the kind of the big bang approach, and I've seen the let's start small and let's kind of evolve and expand and do this kind of incrementally and iteratively approach. I find that ultimately for it to be successful, it needs to work top down. I think a bottom-up strategy ultimately won't work, but that doesn't mean a bottom-up start doesn't work, if that makes sense. And so what I find, for example, a good way of putting it for me is, we talk about leaders putting their trust in teams, saying, hey, leaders aren't going to make all the decisions. They're not going to, they're going to kind of provide a bit of context and a bit of purpose, and they're going to empower the teams with some of the more day-to-day decision making. That's actually a pretty big stretch for a lot of leaders. And so to start small, where we can actually start to apply it within a particular area or particular teams within the business, and to actually start to demonstrate and to prove that the teams can deliver within that type of context. And rather than just asking for trust, proving trustworthiness, I think is really important. And so I think, that type of demonstration of trust and starting to show that they can deliver, showing that there's faster decision making, good decision making, et cetera, breaking down bureaucracy, all of that kind of stuff, that starts to create the case for change for the leadership. And then it's the role of the leadership and the sponsorship within the organization to be able to take those proof points and then actually start drive it down in a much more top-down approach. So I think ultimately, whether you do a big bang or whether it be sort of starting at a small patch here and evolving from there, ultimately it needs to be something that's, and I know I'm sort of, saying stuff that people have already heard before, but ultimately it does need to be a top-down drive. But the small starts often gives the leadership the proof points and the confidence to be able to, and the empirical evidence, I guess, to be able to really run hard with it.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Just back to this slide here, the last point I made was, and the way I look at agility, if I break it down in a really simple definition, is the ability to sense and respond effectively to changing customer and market needs. And I think without all the big words and the fancy language, if we can enable our businesses, our organizations to be able to do that, to get better at sensing and responding, particularly given changes in the market conditions, changes in our environment, all the things that sort of, we talk about, the buzzwords, digital disruption, all of that kind of stuff, the ability to be able to do that better, to sense and respond to changing customer and market needs, I think just makes sense, no matter what the size or scale of the business, no matter what industry that you're in. And so therefore, I think there is that case for agility to be able to build that capability, in whatever space that you're in. So if I jump to so going back to so just going back to this little cartoon here, and what we mean by minimum viable agility, and I've just put this in a kind of very simple, basic way. So what are the minimum set of things that we need to get right to get the benefits of Agile? And I've picked this little quote up, which I've just cut and paste from a little search on the internet, where I've also found minimally viable Agile as a search for Agile practices and ceremonies informed by lean and Agile theory that produces the maximum amount of customer value with the least amount of effort. The only thing I'd say is that it's not necessarily the least amount of effort. We want to be able to definitely the least amount of confusion and the least amount of wastage. But sometimes it's making sure that we place the right effort, I guess, in the appropriate places. And so one of the things I was thinking about was, and oftentimes when in my work introducing Agile to different teams, to across organizations, technology teams, business teams, etc., is that they don't really know of all this Agile jargon and practices and ceremonies and roles and terms and processes and things like that. It's a lot to contend with. And in terms of going, okay, well, out of all of this stuff, what is it? What's the 80-20? What is the things that really make a difference? It's hard for people who are new to this stuff to be able to sort of discern that, to distinguish that. And so one of the quotes that I pulled out was, I think it was an old quote about advertising. I think it was some department store magnate quite a number of years ago said, 50% of the spend I put in advertising is wasted. I just don't know which 50% that is. And I thought that was quite apt in terms of even when we talk about things like Agile, we've placed so much emphasis and there is so much kind of overhead and language and infrastructure that comes with this whole sort of Agile space. And we go, well, what is that? What is the parts that actually matter? And what are the parts that are kind of like just a bit of noise that don't ultimately drive a whole lot of difference? So, and they're the kind of things that I obviously want to start to create a bit of a, some context around and to be able to address as part of our talk today. So now to get into the guts of it, what are the components of minimum viable agility? What I chose to do today was to actually use a metaphor. And that metaphor is that of like if you can imagine a restaurant, and if you can imagine that as customers walk in, they have menus, they've got a menu, and then they make, they ask for orders, and they order off that menu. So there's menu and orders, and then part two, there's the kitchen crew. That's a team of people who take that menu, take those orders, and then that turn that into a product or the meal or the drink or the combination thereof. And then ultimately then part three, service please, which is, I don't know, I've picked that up from MasterChef. I don't know how many sort of MasterChef fans or viewers that we've got on the call, but service please, in terms of the meal being ready, prepared by the kitchen crew, ready to go out to the waiting diners. And so what I wanted to do was kind of use this whole restaurant metaphor, and I'm probably the last most ill-qualified person to be able to be talking about this. I'm a lover of food, but when it comes to how the machinations of how a restaurant works and things like that, I have absolutely no credibility. So I'm going to use this metaphor. Please forgive me. I'm going to use this metaphor very simplistically, but I hope it helps to make sense in terms of some of the minimum viable agile components that we're going to talk about. So how do they map together? What's our recipe? It's our menus and orders. And this is where we talk about having a healthy, clear backlog. The kitchen crew. This is where I talk about the teams that are required and the structure and the practices within those teams that are required for minimum viable agility. And service please, number 3, it's really about throughput. It's the ability for teams to have flow and to be able to deliver increments of product or increments of value to the customer base, either for the sake of return on investment or for the purposes of learning. So I'll just peel them off one by one. So menus and orders. Okay. So no doubt everyone on the call would be familiar with the whole notion of the backlog. And I've juxtaposed that here with just a visual of a menu, which I've just pulled out from Google Images. And I think it's really, one of the things I find is that the construction and management of a backlog in an agile in an agile process or in an agile way of working is just so important. And I know that, whether that seems very, 101 to you, but it's just, I wanted to mention this because I've just seen it go so wrong so often. And the ability for us to be able to, for an organization to be able to have a backlog that's really strategically aligned. So if you think about a menu, right, from a restaurant, they're making choices about having a menu that aligns really well with what is let's call it the strategy of the restaurant. Where are they located? Which market are they serving? Who are their competitors? What is different about that restaurant that separates them from all the other options that people are having within that space or within that location, for example? There's some real important choices that need to be made there, and then that needs to then flow down into the menu. What are we serving? And what we serve or what we don't serve is just as important as what we do serve. And so making really clear trade-off decisions about, okay, aligned to our strategy, what are we going to have on our menu? What are the things that people are going to value that we're going to offer to our patrons or to our potential patrons? I just think about when you watch some of those cooking reality shows where you've got some celebrity chef who goes in there and kind of does a massive restaurant renovation and overhaul, and oftentimes what you see is then they go through the menu and you've got this restaurant and they've got like this menu that kind of looks like a small Bible, and they've got so many things on there, and they're trying to do, they've got all the bells and whistles, and they've got something on the menu that tries to appeal to everyone. And one of the first things I see them do is they just completely strip down that menu. And so when we think about menu and we think about backlogs, making sure that they're really strategically aligned, and what we don't put on there or what we cut out of that backlog, is just as important as what we have on there. And really being clear about, as you can see from a menu, so clear in terms of, what are the categories, and in agile language, we talk about things like epics and features and stories. And so having that really strong steel thread that loops down from, our strategy through to sort of bigger piece of functionality that we want to build, or the bigger solution that we want to build, and then how that sort of breaks down into the kind of the features that we want to deliver, and then down into the sort of more micro level user stories, and sort of having that sort of consistency and that thread that goes all the way through. Those kind of things are really, really important. And so I'll just jump to the next slide just to go into that in a little bit more detail. But one of the things that I just wanted to quickly bring up was in the symposium, which Louise was talking about, that one-day symposium, we had a presentation from, I believe it was Stuart Easton from Transparent Choice. And one of the things that he had in his presentation, which I've just copied and put over here, was that strategic alignment explains 80% of performance differences within organizations. Strategically aligned projects are 50% more likely to achieve business goals, 50% more likely to finish on time, 45% more likely to finish on budget. And I thought it was useful to bring this up again, because whether we're talking about projects or whether we're talking about backlogs, making sure that they're strategically aligned is an absolute critical driver of success. So what are some of the criteria when we talk about the minimum viable agility criteria when we talk about menus and orders? As we talked about, are they strategically aligned? Number two, are they prioritized? It is important to, and I often find that I see a lot of backlogs where there's no clear prioritization. It just looks like one big, it's like they've just taken a whole set of business requirements and just put them into Jira. And there's no clear prioritization in there. So making sure that they're prioritized is really important. That they're iterative and dynamic. That as we go through the whole agile delivery process, that we take feedback, we take learnings, we look out at what's happening in the market, we take into consideration market changes, potentially reg changes, strategic changes, and things like that, and that they're constantly being adapted. And that's constantly being reflected in the backlog in an adaptive way. Making sure that the backlog is customer centric, that we're really thinking about, who are our customers, what are their pain points, what are their needs, and making sure that those things are well reflected in the backlog. Using things like personas, sometimes things like the human-centered design process really helps to inform this process. Making sure that the backlogs are really well maintained. And I've lost count of how many backlogs that I've seen that they've just become a dumping ground for everything. Little ideas, bug fixes, enhancements, suggestions, tasks, and they just become this just endless mess of things. And so, making sure that we really take care of our backlog, making sure that they're well groomed, and just deletion of stuff out of the backlog. If something's been sitting in the backlog for 6 months or more and just been sitting there, then we need to question, does that need to be there? And so deletion is really important and empirically based. And so that empirically based means that, this is where when we build functionality and we put it out to our users, then we want to be able to sort of get some empirical learnings, and we want to take those learnings and reflect those back into the backlog somehow. So if there's questions at the end, definitely we'll have time.
We've got one now, Michael. Just give me a second. There we go. Cassia should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. It's great so far. So thank you for everything that you're talking about. It's very relevant to me. So I'm loving all of this. My question around the menu and order phase criteria, if you have multiple, like when you're doing a very big program of work and there are multiple programs, multiple streams, know that in Agile, each team is responsible for their own delivery. What I find is who and how is it best to make sure that there is connectivity and cross communication between those teams to deliver not just their bit of the pie, but the pie to be delicious and to go out to market. That's where I think a lot of things break down. They become so concerned about their own delivery stream that they then don't have any of that cross-functionality. And that's when you don't get the end-to-end result.
Yes. Yeah, so, and let me know if this kind of addresses your question, Kasia.
Yes.
And this is where you've got multiple streams, multiple programs of work, and different teams kind of delivering their parts of it, but it's more of a part of a puzzle, I guess. Or then that's where some of the, let's call it sort of scaling approaches are helpful. And essentially what it is irrespective of what scaling kind of approach that you use, essentially what you're looking for and what's needed, and you kind of get this across some of those different sort of scaling approaches is someone who has oversight across all the teams from a product build point of view. So, and that's where you might see roles like a chief product owner, for example, or sometimes in SAFE they'll call it a product manager, and within their structure they have product owners who work with individual teams. But in essence, the logic is the same, that you've got an oversight role who makes sure that all the different pieces that the teams are putting together sort of come together cohesively in terms and are aligned to, I guess, the strategic vision and roadmap for that overall product or solution or whatever you call it. And so I think that, but they're obviously operating at a sort of a higher level in terms of operating across looking at more the feature set that we're building, as opposed to getting into the depths of, let's say, the user stories of the individual teams. So they're kind of looking at it with a bit more of that as a higher level of abstraction view. And then the other role is also, you've obviously got the Scrum Masters who are coordinating each of the and helping facilitating the delivery across each of the Scrum teams. And then that can oftentimes, if you've got these multiple streams and delivery components that you're talking about, having like again, sometimes they're called chief Scrum Masters. Sometimes in a different framework like SAFE, they're called release train engineers. And that role is there to really help coordinate the delivery across all the teams, because especially when you've got lots of different teams coming together, there's going to be a lot of dependencies. And so there's going to be dependencies across the business. There's going to be dependencies across different systems and things like that. And so having someone like having that role to be able to sort of coordinate all the different, let's say, Scrum teams, and making sure that they're all sort of working together and delivering things in the right sequence according to when different system components become ready, etc. And so bringing sort of the technology and the business bits together is the role of whether you call it, again, a chief Scrum Master or whether you call it a release train engineer. That's really that's really pivotal to that role. And so when you're in an environment like that, having those type of roles, I think, are really helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Kasia. Comment from Michael Alakwa. Agree with everything Michael has said. So a vote of confidence there for you, Michael. And another question from Albert, asking that in Agile project management, how do we judge the success of the project, and what are these criteria?
Agile project, how do we judge the success of the project? Look, I think that the success of the project is really about, I think, for example, in an Agile project, you can still have a business case, and that business case will still outline, what are the success criteria or the benefits criteria that you have in that, that's going to, ultimately assess the success or failure of that project. And so from an Agile point of view, I don't think that in terms of from an outcome point of view, that changes. But the way I would see it is that, again, depending on the project, the agile methodology will kind of de-risk your project and helps you get to that outcome that you're looking for with a little bit more certainty. Because what we're doing is we're doing things in small steps, small iterative steps, and rather than doing one big requirements building, design, build, test, one sort of big exercise, where what I would call a big leap of faith exercise, what we're doing is we're taking leaps of logic, small steps of logic along the way, so that we're de-risking a lot of the components of our delivery, so that we drive a lot more, hopefully drive a lot more certainty that the benefits or the outcomes that we want for that project, that we're able to hit that with more predictability.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'll just quickly jump through to the second phase, the kitchen crew. Okay, so no doubt you have seen, I put this image up here, no doubt when we talk about agile teams, this is the stereotypical kind of setup that you probably imagine, or that you've seen people like me present this type of stuff, and this is the kind of images that they show. Bunch of cool people, casual gear, got their mineral water on the table, they've got their big showcase screen up front, laptops, all sitting around together, post-it notes on the wall, post-it notes on the windows, etc. And so, so this is kind of like your typical, stereotypical view, perception of agile teams working together. You got a little clock in the middle there. But what I wanted to do was, again, in line with my restaurant metaphor, my extremely simplified restaurant metaphor, is to talk about the kitchen crew. And the kitchen crew ultimately is a team. And this is where we want to really unpack, what does it mean to be an agile team? And so first of all, I've just taken this definition, which I've picked up, a real team, a team task boundaries, clearly specified authority to manage their own work processes, and membership stability over a reasonable period of time. The only thing I'd probably add in there is the team has a clear outcome, mission, or mandate, a reason for being as well. So if we can kind of think of that as being kind of like the parameters of what a team looks like, I wanted to start to work through what are the different components. Again, going back to the topic of minimum viable agility, what are the kind of the core building blocks that we need within a team for that team to kind of operate in an agile way, and operate really effectively in an agile way. So first of all, structure. Structure is important. So teams to be made up of 5 to 9 people. And I think it is really important to try and keep the number of people within each team below double digits. And because oftentimes, and I have seen that teams can swell, and they can swell. And I've seen agile teams that swell up to 15 to 20 people. And so, and that causes a number of issues. It causes a number of issues in terms of coordination across the teams. It creates a lot more complexity around lines of communication within the team. And also in terms of having, when you've got a small team, everyone is obviously really has to carry the load. And oftentimes what I find is when there's large teams is that there can be a tendency for team members to kind of either get lost, or even, or kind of, maybe even hide in the process, or things that kind of get a bit confusing, duplication of work, and you start to get a lot of inefficiencies. And so maintaining that team structure between that 5 to 9 people, I think is really important to be able to have as a goal. The other piece is around autonomous. So having the capabilities, the multidisciplinary capabilities within the team, for the team to be able to deliver end to end, I think is really important. Now that's easy. Obviously it's easy to say, really hard to do in practice. And so, but I think what we need to do is try and, as much as possible, be able to have that end-to-end capabilities for teams to be able to deliver, their whatever they're accountable to delivering that team, that they have all the functions and the decision-making power to be able to do that within that team. And sometimes, look, in reality, there's going to be members of the organization that they need to rely on outside of that, and that could be people in the business, that could be people in compliance, that could be people in finance, it could be people in some technology SMEs that they need to reach out to. So acknowledge that there's inevitably going to be people outside of the team that they need to reach out to deliver things and get input and dependence and manage dependencies and things like that. But we just want to create an ecosystem within the team for them to either, obviously ideally have that within the team, but also have a mechanism where they could actually reach out to people outside the team for the team to be able to deliver more quite fluidly end to end. So that's structure. They're the sort of key structure components. The next piece is around practices. There's lots of practices, obviously, when we talk about agile teams, when we talk about even methodologies like Scrum, there's lots and lots of practices. Some of the things that I think are really important from a minimum viable point of view is, one is inspect and adapt on cadence. And so this is where teams at set intervals pause and reflect on how they're working. And this is really about growth. It's really about continuous improvement. It's really about making sure that we're pivoting in the way that we operate so that we're constantly becoming more effective and more efficient in the way that we work. And so one of the things in my role as a coach, oftentimes I'm working with lots of different teams, and I can't be across all their ceremonies. I can't be across all their practices and all their different backlog management sessions and things like that. But one thing that I always try and do and prioritize is to try and get to all the retrospectives of the teams. That's something that I definitely prioritize, because I really want to see how the teams are working, how are they improving, and when they commit to things to improve on, because at the end of a retrospective, the team would generally come up with, typically 1 to at the most 3 things that they want to focus on to improve before their next retrospective or for their next sprint, for example. And so I want to make sure that that those things, those issues, those improvement areas are being actioned, and so that we're not getting to this going into this constant repetitive cycle where teams are just bringing up the same stuff again and again and again, and which makes suddenly those retrospectives become really, really ineffective instruments. And so that's one thing that I really prioritize, and I think it's really important for teams to practice, to engage in that practice. Visualizing the work, and I know it's difficult when I talk about visualizing the work, when I'm talking about physically co-located teams, and having using the environment and the walls around them to be able to start to map out their Kanban walls and start map out their tasks and map out their metrics and things like that in a really visible way. And I know we've got so many people working from home now. We can't sort of take that for granted anymore. But I think that we can start to mimic that within an online environment. Using tools like Jira, using tools like in my world, we use Jira a lot for this, for visualization. We use things like and some of the other sort of collaboration tools that are out there. Whether it be things like Miro or Mural and things like that. But I think visualizing the work is really important in terms of helping teams to be able to collaborate, helping teams to be able to work together, helping teams to be able to, really stay on track, helping teams to be a lot more accountable and have that transparency. So I think visualizing the work, I think, is something as a minimum viable practice is really important to adopt. The next one, daily stand-ups. And daily stand-ups are great, especially when you've got a dedicated team working together to have that regular checkpoint every day to be able to make sure, are we staying on track? What am I doing to be able to deliver on our goals? What are the things that we need to coordinate on? What are the things that are happening in our day that we need to be able to sort of collaborate on? And just picking up those items, making sure that we sort of identify issues and resolve them quickly before they become big issues or before they really stunt the ability of the team to deliver, to be able to remediate those things really quickly and efficiently. And so I think those things are really important. So those daily stand-ups are a great mechanism for that. And it's not a mechanism for, it's not a status reporting mechanism, definitely, that's for sure. So just be aware of that. But I think it's really important to practice as an MVA practice. Demonstrate progress on cadence and being able to really be sort of deliver something and show our progress and show that to showcase that to our teams, to our stakeholders, and doing that on a sort of on regular intervals, I think is super important as a practice. Commits the team to just delivering stuff, to doing things, to getting stuff out there, to making things tangible, because because that's where the value lies. It's not in the documentation. It's not in the words. It's not in the meetings. It's actually when we actually start to deliver stuff, components of things, where that's where the value. That's where we get the value in terms of things that we can actually put into production or put out there for our customers and actually start to get some return on that, or value in terms of the learnings that we get from it. So I think just being able to have that, demonstrate that progress on cadence is really important, and just cadence-based goals. So. One of the things that I used to work with Toyota, we talk about is the improvement kata, which is like, we've got this, we know our end, we have a firm view on what our end game is, what our definition, or we call our definition of awesome is, our North Star. But we also want to be very clear on what's our next improvement target, what's our next target condition, what's our next little goal. And so what's that next increment that we want to get to that's going to be sort of on the journey to our awesome. And so being really clear on that and having those goals, particularly at a sprint level, really clear along the way is super important. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is mindset. Mindset is important. Making sure that as a team that there's shared ownership, shared accountability. There's a willingness to be able to not just stay within our lane, but also work across the team. When we talk about things like, having T-shaped people who have our particular area of expertise, but we are able to operate, and we have the ability, but also the appetite to be able to, work on our skill sets to be able to support the team in whatever capacity that's required. Having a real strong customer focus. Having a learning and experimental mindset in the way we do things, respect for people, the respect for our teams, making sure that everyone's got a voice, making sure everyone is heard, and being able to operate in small batches and things like that. So some of those, and by transparency. So by all means, these mindset points aren't exhaustive, but obviously those mindset is absolutely key in terms of making sure that the team works productively. So I notice I'm just doing a quick time check. So I'm going to just jump to the last one, which is about service speed, which is about throughput. And this is the ability for the teams to actually start to deliver, get to what we call in Agile a definition of done. And this is about flow. This is about things like producing things and cycle times and throughput, and I think the ability to be able to just to build things and actually put out increments of our product or increments of functionality, increments of the software if we're working in the tech space. I think that flow, that throughput is really, really important. And so that's that kind of rounds out the restaurant illustration of which I've put here as service now. And just to read this quote here, above all, Agile enterprises understand that speed is essential. The velocity at which they execute directly affects their ability to learn and adapt to change. And those feedback loops, that ability to put something out there and get the feedback loop is really critical. And I think it wouldn't be complete when we talk about minimum viable agility if we don't talk about this whole notion of throughput. And oftentimes it's really hard for large organizations where there's a lot of legacy and things like that. It's hard where they have immature or sort of unstable, let's say, environments. They have very slow and kind of cumbersome release processes and things like that. And so I find that a lot of organizations that I've worked with, they kind of get constipated. They've got all this stuff, but they just can't get it out the door. And so, and that really affects the throughput. And so, and I think that being able to have that mechanism in place to be able to get things out the door, put things in market, get the learnings, etc., that throughput is really, really critical as well. So my last thing is I just wanted to just quickly show, given that we've talked about the restaurant theme, this is a Vietnamese restaurant that my kids and I go to every now and again. It's in Bankstown, which is on the southwest of Sydney. And this place, they pretty much make just one dish, which is the pho Vietnamese noodles. And it is the destination, or in my mind anyway, it is the destination for pho noodles in all of Sydney. And yeah, the way this place runs, it's like a well-oiled machine. You know, when you look on their menu, this is the only thing or variants of pho. You can either get this in beef, red beef, cooked beef combination, or chicken, but essentially, apart from those variations, this is the only thing that they do. You know, so they've really zoomed in on this on their menu. And in terms of their throughput, their speed, their cycle time is incredible. Like literally, you go there, you put in an order, and almost within 1 minute, you got your meal coming at you. The meal comes to your table. And so, just in terms of, and yet the quality. The taste, the quality is, like I said, it's the destination for this in my mind in all of Sydney. And so when you think about their menu, when you think about their quality, their throughput, it's no surprise that this venue has been around for so long and incredibly successful. So just wanted to round out that restaurant metaphor. I know it was a bit, it wasn't too refined, but hopefully that was helpful in terms of kind of really bringing those minimum viable agility components to life.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. We've got a question from Darren, which I'll go to in a second. But I just wanted to make the point. What was really interesting to me was almost some of what you didn't say. So you didn't talk about, you know, you must adopt a specific methodology. You must still be Scrum, or you must have everybody go off and get certified and safe. It's, you know, minimum viable agility seems to be about using the principles in a way that makes sense for your organization. Stop me if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly. But I really got a feeling of principle, I guess, from your presentation, which was, I think, helpful for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely wanted to make sure that today's discussion was framework agnostic.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't going to be, hey, look, because sometimes people have particular experience or expertise in a particular framework, and they kind of, you know, find it more comfortable to kind of lean on that. But in terms of some of the things that we talk about, backlogs, teams, and throughput, I think they apply irrespective, agnostic of which framework that we use. And I think they're the things that, again, and on the reverse side, where they fall over is because no matter what framework you use, they're falling over in one, two, or more of those, or all three of those components. And so that's why I wanted to kind of sort of distill that down and zoom in on that a little bit more today.
Yeah, great. I'm going to unmute Darren. Darren, would you like to ask Michael a question?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I suppose my question was probably linked to that last statement you were making there as well, because we've been sort of talking about, you know, those minimum viable principles, and that makes perfect sense. But in your experience, what do you see as maybe those main contributors to waste or going over the top with these implementations? You know, are there certain aspects there that you sort of like call out those danger signs, those warnings where it really isn't necessary for that minimum viable approach?
Yeah. Well, I mean, where I see a lot of wastage, when we talk about so for example, when I talk about the backlog, where I see a lot of wastage is that there is real pressure to add a lot of items in the backlog. And because I do a lot of work in the technology arena, sort of lots of features, requirements, pieces that, you know, people think are really, really important to build, but at the end of the day, they actually add very little value, but now that we've built it, we now need to maintain it. We now need to sort of, we've inherited the overhead of that. We now need to sort of continue to remediate the bugs around that and things like that. So one area that I find a lot of waste is just really clear, brutal prioritization within the backlog, and really being able to negotiate our scope so that it is super strategically aligned, it's super prioritized, and we're really clear on what's going to drive value versus not. And making sure that we try and test things. We start to use a hypothesis-driven approach to kind of test things before we commit to them, because once we commit to them, we start to consume a lot of effort and expense. So that's yeah.
To that point, I suppose then the decision making and making sure you've got the right decision makers in the room to have that brutal prioritization is really critical and important there, and that probably needs to filter down through. So that you've got that same cascade of decision making across the organization.
Yes, yeah. That's right. So absolutely, because I think when we talk about things like decomposing things from, let's say, strategic, we talk about, in Agile we talk about epics, features, and user stories. I think we need to make those trade-offs at every point. In terms of at the epic level, then down into the feature level, and down into the story level. And so, and we need to have those sort of negotiations at every point. And so, yeah, you're right. So, and which sort of goes back to sort of from the leadership down, there needs to be that consistency.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Darren. Great question. Question from Albert, and it's a big question, so just conscious of time. What's the main difference between traditional project management and agile project management? Will we completely abandon the use of traditional project manager in the future? Project management in the future?
No, look, I don't. Yeah. So, quick answer to that is I don't. Will we abandon traditional project managers? I'd say no. I think that. When we talk about traditional project management, and if I think about sort of that being more waterfall project management, I think there are always cases where waterfall project management is going to be important. I think there's going to be elements where the date that we need to meet is going to be pretty fixed. What we need to deliver is going to be pretty clear, and we know what's going to drive, in terms of what's going to drive value and things like that. So there's less ambiguity and less uncertainty around certain things. And so within those types of situations, I think waterfall or traditional project management to be able to manage, the scope, the cost, the timelines, to be able to deliver, I think is, in my mind, won't go away.
Yeah. I agree with you, actually, and it's something I feel quite strongly about. I think what we have now is, the influence of agile terms and agile principles. Those terms and principles have permeated right through project management broadly, but there are certainly types of projects that don't lend themselves to an agile or iterative delivery. Digging tunnels, bridges. You can use the agile principles, absolutely. But you can't do those types of projects in the same way as you can work on technology projects. So I think it's good news for all those old dinosaurs that came up through the traditional, let's say, route. But look, I think the influence of agile is with us to stay, and I think will only get more prevalent as big organizations adopt. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, and I think that there are components of agile that can be used on, that work really well on waterfall projects, like visualization of workflow, sort of more decentralized decision making, things like, look, I see teams still doing like daily stand-ups and all that kind of thing. Look, I think there are practices and mindsets within agile, collaboration and those type of things, which to me, I think they're kind of diagnostic of whether you do agile or not. Sometimes we have we see these little examples of waterfall command and control style of project management versus agile being collaborative. Well, it's kind of not like that, and I really hate those type of caricatures that get put in place, because it's really not like that. And I think there's a lot of grey there, and I think we need to be able to accommodate that.
Oh, thanks. Last comment from ADMB. Sorry, I don't know your name, but Michael, good review and analogy resonated, and it's clear you've been through the trenches. Do you think waterfall and agile are often used simultaneously, iterative and incremental?
Are they used simultaneously? If I kind of interpret, if I think I know what the question's asking, whether can they be kind of used in more of a hybrid type way? And I think yes, absolutely. And I think that when you work with sort of large sort of organizations that have been around for a long time, there's lots of legacy systems and components, and a lot of these old systems, they're not really sort of built for agile. We need to be able to manage them in a waterfall way. I think so. A lot of the stuff that I work on, essentially has elements of both. And so I see that, when I think about pure play agile, I think about instances where it's pretty much all digital. It's all sort of go fast, greenfield technology, very little sort of orchestrated needed with different legacy systems and things like that. So you've got teams that are set up all on a digital platform. They can kind of run, one can run search, one can run sort of different menu options, one can run this and different, that kind of thing. So it can easily be decoupled, not a lot of dependencies or zero dependencies, and kind of operate autonomously instead of team and build stuff and and be able to independently put stuff into production. That's pure play agile. I've actually never worked in that environment. I've always worked in an environment where it's been a bit of a messy bit of both. And so, and then what that means is that we've had to kind of juggle both the agile and the waterfall components. And there's kind of ways to be able to do that in an agile way. And maybe that's something that we can kind of delve into a little bit more in a later talk.
Well, I was just gonna say, this is essentially in our organisation, this is the space that we play in the most often, and we see a lot of large organisations, a lot of government agencies who want to be as agile as they possibly can, but they are constrained by waterfall governance.
Yep.
And I definitely think there's a future webinar around some of that stuff. So. If there's no other questions, I'd very much like to thank you for your time this afternoon, Michael. Just to remind everybody, we will make the recording available. I know some people joined a little bit later. We'll get the editing elves busy in the background, and the recording will be on the website in the next few days. If you would like to subscribe to our newsletter, again, please have a look on the website. We've got a good program of events coming up over the next few months. So, Michael, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, everyone. Thanks for your great questions as well.
Thanks, folks.